"Search her bag," the billionaire said, and within seconds the elegant ballroom fell completely silent. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of guests, but nobody seemed to notice them anymore. Every eye in the room turned toward a single woman standing near the service station. Emily Parker froze where she stood, a silver tray balanced carefully in her hands. She had worked hundreds of events during her years as a waitress, but nothing like this had ever happened before. Across the room, Charles Whitmore, one of the most influential businessmen in New York, stared directly at her. His expression was cold, confident, and completely certain. Just moments earlier, the evening had been unfolding perfectly. The charity gala occupied the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, one of the city's most prestigious venues. Politicians, executives, celebrities, and philanthropists filled the room. Emily and the other staff members moved efficiently between tables, serving drinks and meals while ensuring every guest received exceptional service. Then everything changed. Charles had suddenly realized that his antique watch was missing. The watch was famous among people who knew him. It had belonged to his grandfather and was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. More importantly, it carried sentimental value that money could never replace. The moment he noticed it was gone, concern quickly turned into suspicion. Security staff were called. Guests were asked to remain in the ballroom. Employees were questioned. According to several witnesses, Emily had been the last staff member seen serving Charles's private VIP table. That fact alone was enough to place her at the center of attention. "Sir, there must be some mistake," Emily said calmly. Her voice remained steady despite the tension surrounding her. "I have never touched your watch." Charles folded his arms. "Then perhaps you can explain why you were the last person working in that section before it disappeared." A murmur spread through the crowd. Emily could feel dozens of strangers silently judging her. Some looked uncomfortable. Others appeared curious. A few seemed convinced of her guilt already. She set the tray down carefully and met Charles's gaze. "I cannot explain where your watch is because I do not know where it is." One security supervisor stepped forward. "Miss Parker, would you be willing to cooperate while we investigate?" Emily nodded immediately. Of course. She had nothing to hide. Yet the situation felt humiliating. Every second seemed to stretch longer than the one before it. Several staff members who knew her well exchanged worried looks. They understood exactly what kind of person Emily was. Honest. Reliable. Hardworking. But in moments like these, reputation often lost against suspicion. Charles remained convinced he was making the correct decision. Throughout his business career, he had built success by trusting his instincts. When something seemed wrong, he acted quickly. Hesitation, in his view, created problems. Action solved them. At least that was what he believed. Security personnel began checking nearby areas. Guests whispered among themselves. Emily stood quietly near the wall, refusing to argue or create a scene. Inside, however, her heart was racing. She knew how quickly accusations could damage a person's life. Even if she was proven innocent later, some people would always remember this night differently. As the search continued, an older guest approached Charles. "Perhaps we should wait before making assumptions," the man suggested politely. Charles shook his head. "The facts are obvious." Emily heard those words clearly. The facts are obvious. The statement stayed with her because nothing about the situation felt obvious at all. 20 minutes later, the watch still had not been found. The tension inside the ballroom grew heavier. Security cameras were being reviewed. More questions were being asked. And standing at the center of it all was a waitress who suddenly found herself fighting to protect something more valuable than any watch. Her name. What nobody in that room realized was that the truth hiding behind the missing watch would soon expose a mistake far greater than anyone could imagine. The ballroom was finally cleared shortly after midnight, but for Emily Parker, the night was far from over. Security personnel had completed their search. Her locker had been checked. Her belongings had been examined. Every question had been asked multiple times. Yet the missing watch remained exactly that. Missing. No evidence had been found linking her to its disappearance, but that fact did little to repair the damage already done. By the time Emily stepped outside the hotel, the cool New York air felt heavier than usual. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching yellow taxi cabs pass beneath the city lights. The humiliation of the evening replayed endlessly in her mind. She could still hear the whispers. Still see the suspicious glances. Still feel the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her as though she were guilty. The next morning brought no relief. Before sunrise, messages had already begun appearing online. Several guests had posted vague comments about an incident involving a missing luxury watch at a charity gala. No names were mentioned at first, but details spread quickly. By afternoon, rumors had taken on a life of their own. Some people claimed a waitress had been caught stealing. Others insisted security footage existed. None of it was true. Yet truth rarely traveled as quickly as speculation. Emily arrived at work hoping the situation would settle down. Instead, she was immediately called into a meeting with hotel management. Daniel Foster, the operations director, looked uncomfortable as she entered his office. He had known Emily for nearly 3 years. He respected her work ethic and trusted her character. Unfortunately, trust was not always enough. "Please sit down," he said quietly. Emily already knew the conversation would not be pleasant. She sat across from him and waited. Daniel rubbed his forehead before speaking. "Until the investigation is complete, we are placing you on temporary suspension." The words landed exactly as she expected, yet they still hurt. "Because someone accused me," she asked calmly. Daniel sighed. "Because the situation has become complicated." Emily looked toward the office window overlooking the city. "I understand." What bothered her most was not losing shifts. It was knowing that suspicion alone had become stronger than years of honest work. As she left the office, several coworkers watched her from a distance. A few offered supportive smiles. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody knew what to say. Once doubt enters a room, even good people sometimes become uncertain. Over the next few days, Emily's world seemed to shrink. The routine she depended on disappeared. The regular customers she greeted every week were gone. The familiar rhythm of work was replaced by long hours at home. Meanwhile, the rumors continued spreading. One afternoon, Emily stopped at a grocery store near her apartment. As she stood in line, she noticed 2 strangers glancing in her direction. One whispered something to the other. Both looked away when she met their eyes. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps it was not. Either way, the feeling stayed with her. That evening, she visited her father. He lived in a modest apartment on the other side of the city and had been dealing with health challenges for several years. Emily helped prepare dinner and organize his medications before finally telling him what had happened. Her father listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished, he smiled gently. "Do you know who you are?" Emily looked confused. "What kind of question is that?" "An important one." He leaned back in his chair. "Because if you know who you are, other people's assumptions cannot change it." Emily thought about those words during the subway ride home. They did not solve her problems. They did not clear her name. But they reminded her of something she desperately needed to remember. Her character had not changed simply because someone accused her of something she did not do. Across town, Charles Whitmore continued believing he had acted responsibly. As far as he knew, the investigation was moving forward exactly as it should. What he did not realize was that while a missing watch remained unresolved, the consequences of his accusation were already reshaping someone else's life. And the deeper those consequences reached, the more difficult they would become to undo. While rumors continued circulating through the city, very few people knew anything about the real Emily Parker. To most strangers, she had become a headline without a name, a face attached to an accusation that remained unresolved. But beyond the gossip and speculation existed a life that looked nothing like the story people imagined. Every morning, Emily woke before 6 o'clock. She prepared breakfast, reviewed household expenses, and checked on her father before beginning whatever temporary work she could find. Since her suspension, money had become a constant concern. Yet she never allowed her worries to become someone else's burden. One rainy Tuesday morning, she arrived at her father's apartment carrying groceries purchased with carefully planned coupons and discounts. The older man greeted her with a smile. "You should be taking care of yourself too," he said. Emily laughed softly. "I am." Her father looked at the bags on the kitchen counter. "You know what I mean." He had watched his daughter spend years putting other people first. Long before the accusation, she had quietly built a reputation among neighbors and friends for helping wherever she could. If an elderly resident needed groceries carried upstairs, Emily volunteered. If a child in the building struggled with homework, Emily offered assistance. None of these actions attracted attention. She never expected them to. They simply reflected who she was. Later that afternoon, Emily stopped by a local community center where she occasionally volunteered. Several children immediately ran toward her. Their excitement made her smile for the first time all day. Unlike adults, they had not read online comments or listened to rumors. They only knew the person who showed up consistently and treated them with kindness. One young girl handed Emily a drawing she had made. The picture showed a smiling waitress standing beneath a bright sun. Across the top, written in colorful letters, were 4 simple words. "Thank you, Miss Emily." Emily carefully folded the drawing and placed it in her bag. Small moments like that reminded her why character mattered more than reputation. Reputation depended on what people believed. Character depended on what was true. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Charles Whitmore continued moving through his normal routine. Meetings filled his calendar. Executives sought his approval. Investors praised recent business results. Yet despite his success, the missing watch remained an unresolved frustration. He reviewed security reports almost daily. Investigators continued examining footage and interviewing staff. Every report seemed to point toward uncertainty rather than answers. One evening, Charles requested personnel records related to the hotel employees who had worked the gala. Most files were routine. Then he opened Emily's record. He expected very little. Instead, he found years of positive performance evaluations. Managers consistently praised her professionalism. Customer feedback was overwhelmingly favorable. Attendance records were nearly flawless. Several supervisors specifically mentioned her honesty and reliability. Charles frowned. The information did not fit the picture he had constructed in his mind. He continued reading. One review described how Emily had once returned an expensive diamond bracelet left behind by a guest. Another documented an occasion when she located a misplaced envelope containing thousands of dollars and immediately reported it. The more he read, the more uncomfortable he became. None of it proved anything about the missing watch. Yet it raised a troubling question. Had he judged her too quickly? Charles closed the file and stared out the window of his office. Below, the city moved through another busy evening. Somewhere among millions of people was a waitress whose entire life had been reduced to suspicion. And for the first time since the gala, a small crack appeared in the certainty he had carried from the beginning. He still believed the truth would eventually emerge. What he no longer knew was whether that truth would support the conclusion he had already made. And as investigators prepared to review new evidence from the hotel security system, answers were finally beginning to move closer than anyone realized. 3 weeks after the gala, the investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. The watch remained missing. No clear suspect had emerged. Yet despite the lack of evidence, many people continued treating Emily Parker as though the case had already been solved. For Emily, the hardest part was not the suspension itself. It was living under a cloud of doubt that seemed impossible to escape. Every day felt like a test of patience. Every conversation carried an invisible weight. Still, she refused to let bitterness define her. One afternoon, while helping organize books at the community center, her phone rang unexpectedly. The caller was Daniel Foster. Emily stepped into a quiet hallway before answering. "Hello." There was a brief pause. "Emily, I wanted to update you." His voice sounded cautious. "The investigation is continuing." Emily smiled faintly. "That does not sound like much of an update." Daniel let out a small laugh. "Fair enough. But there is something else. Security specialists are reviewing additional footage from several camera angles." Emily leaned against the wall. "And? Nothing conclusive yet." She thanked him and ended the call. Although the news changed nothing, she sensed a shift. For the first time, it felt as though people were beginning to look beyond the obvious assumptions. Meanwhile, inside the corporate offices of Whitmore Hospitality Group, Charles Whitmore sat reviewing a new report prepared by the investigation team. The document summarized every known detail surrounding the missing watch. He read carefully, searching for certainty. Instead, he found contradictions. Witness statements conflicted with one another. Timelines contained gaps. Small details that once seemed insignificant were becoming increasingly important. One section of the report focused on security footage from the ballroom. The footage confirmed that Emily had served the VIP section that evening. However, it also showed numerous guests moving through the area after she left. Some entered conversations. Others retrieved coats, purses, and personal belongings. The environment had been far more chaotic than Charles originally remembered. He frowned as he studied the timeline. The certainty he once felt was slowly beginning to weaken. Later that week, investigators arranged a detailed review of every available camera angle. Hours of footage were examined frame by frame. Most of it revealed nothing useful. Guests talking. Servers working. Staff moving equipment. Then one analyst noticed something unusual. During a brief moment near the end of the gala, an elderly VIP guest appeared to pick up several personal items from the table where Charles had been seated. The image was partially blocked by another attendee, making it difficult to determine exactly what had happened. The analyst flagged the footage for further review. At first, nobody considered it significant. Yet the more they watched, the more questions emerged. Charles received a call the following morning. "We may have found something worth investigating," the lead investigator explained. Charles listened carefully as the footage was described. When the call ended, he remained silent for several minutes. The possibility seemed small. Uncertain. But it represented the first meaningful development since the night of the gala. Across town, Emily spent the evening helping her father prepare dinner. She had no idea that new evidence was being examined. No idea that the direction of the investigation might finally be changing. As they sat together at the kitchen table, her father noticed she seemed tired. "You are carrying too much of this on your shoulders," he said gently. Emily looked down at her plate. "I just want the truth to come out." Her father nodded. "The truth has a way of arriving eventually. The challenge is having the patience to wait for it." Those words stayed with her long after she returned home. And as another night settled over New York City, investigators continued studying the footage that everyone else had overlooked. Hidden within a few ordinary seconds of video was a detail that had the power to change everything. The investigators spent the next several days focused on a detail that most people would have ignored. At first glance, the footage appeared ordinary. Guests were leaving the ballroom near the end of the gala. Coats were being collected. Personal belongings were being gathered from tables. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet when technicians enhanced the video and synchronized multiple camera angles, a different picture began to emerge. The elderly VIP guest who had briefly appeared in the footage was identified as Leonard Hayes, a retired philanthropist and longtime friend of Charles Whitmore. Leonard was widely respected, known for his generosity and decades of charitable work. Nobody had ever considered him relevant to the investigation. After all, he had no reason to take someone else's property. Still, the footage raised questions that could not be ignored. During one particular moment, Leonard appeared to collect several items from the VIP table while preparing to leave. The angle was imperfect, and the object could not be clearly identified, but investigators noticed that his movements coincided with the exact period when the watch was believed to have disappeared. Charles reviewed the footage himself. He watched it once. Then twice. Then several more times. Each viewing produced the same uncomfortable feeling. For weeks he had focused entirely on employees. For weeks he had assumed the answer was somewhere among the staff. Now, for the first time, he was being forced to consider another possibility. Meanwhile, Emily continued searching for temporary work while waiting for the investigation to conclude. The suspension had created financial strain, but she refused to allow frustration to control her life. One afternoon she helped organize a fundraising event at the community center. Several volunteers had learned about her situation and quietly offered support. Emily appreciated their kindness, yet she remained determined to solve her own problems. As the event ended, one volunteer approached her. "I do not know what happened at that hotel," the woman said, "but everyone here knows the kind of person you are." Emily smiled gratefully. Those simple words meant more than the woman realized. Back at Whitmore Hospitality headquarters, investigators arranged a meeting with Leonard Hayes. The elderly philanthropist appeared surprised by the request but agreed immediately. During the conversation, he answered every question openly. He clearly remembered attending the gala. He remembered speaking with donors, meeting guests, and leaving late in the evening. What he could not remember was every item he had gathered from the table before departing. It was a busy night, Leonard admitted. "I may have picked up things that belonged to me and things that did not. At my age, memory is not always perfect." The statement immediately captured the attention of everyone in the room. Charles exchanged a glance with the lead investigator. For the first time since the investigation began, a completely different explanation seemed possible. Leonard offered to check his residence thoroughly. The following day, he contacted investigators with unexpected news. While organizing belongings from the gala, he discovered a small travel case he did not recognize. The moment he opened it, his heart sank. Inside was an antique watch. Charles received the call while sitting in his office. For several seconds after hearing the news, he could not speak. The watch had not been stolen. It had never left the possession of respected guests and friends. It had been mistakenly collected during the confusion of the evening and forgotten. Weeks of suspicion. Weeks of rumors. Weeks of damage. All because of a misunderstanding. Charles slowly lowered the phone and stared across the city skyline. The relief of finding the watch lasted only a moment. What followed was something far heavier. Because now he knew exactly what the investigation had revealed. Emily Parker had been telling the truth from the very beginning. And the consequences of failing to believe her were only beginning to fully settle upon him. The discovery changed everything. Within hours of confirming that the watch had been found among Leonard Hayes's belongings, the investigation officially cleared Emily Parker of any wrongdoing. There was no theft. No misconduct. No hidden scheme. The truth was painfully simple. During the confusion at the end of the gala, an elderly guest had accidentally collected an item that did not belong to him and later forgotten about it. What should have been a minor misunderstanding had grown into weeks of suspicion and public embarrassment. For Charles Whitmore, the realization felt heavier with every passing hour. He sat alone in his office reviewing the final report. The facts were undeniable. Emily had been innocent from the very beginning. Every statement she made had been truthful. Every denial had been honest. Yet despite that truth, she had carried the burden of an accusation that never should have followed her. Charles closed the report and stared out at the Manhattan skyline. For the first time in many years, success offered no comfort. Financial victories suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the mistakes sitting on his desk. Meanwhile, Emily was helping children prepare for an educational workshop at the community center when her phone rang. She almost ignored the call because she did not recognize the number. At the last moment, she answered. It was Daniel Foster. His voice sounded different from usual. Lighter. Relieved. Emily, the investigation is over. She paused. And? There was a brief silence. You were right. The watch was never stolen. It was recovered from a guest who took it by mistake. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. Not because she felt victorious. Not because she wanted someone to suffer consequences. She simply felt exhausted. Weeks of uncertainty finally came to an end with a single sentence. Several volunteers noticed her expression immediately. What happened? One asked. Emily lowered the phone and smiled. The truth finally showed up. News spread quickly throughout the hotel. Employees who had quietly supported Emily felt relieved. Others felt embarrassed for doubting her. Management immediately began discussing how to address the situation publicly. Yet none of those conversations were as difficult as the one Charles knew he would eventually need to have himself. Over the following days, he learned more about the impact of the accusation. He discovered how the suspension had affected Emily financially. He learned about the rumors she endured. He heard from employees who described how isolated she had become after the gala. Each detail added another layer of regret. What troubled him most was not that he had been wrong. It was how certain he had been while being wrong. The memory of that night replayed repeatedly in his mind. He remembered standing in the ballroom. He remembered looking directly at Emily. He remembered assuming that confidence and authority were enough to justify suspicion. Now those memories felt entirely different. One afternoon, Charles visited the hotel ballroom while it sat empty between events. Rows of tables were arranged neatly beneath the chandeliers. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet he could still picture the crowd watching as Emily stood alone at the center of attention. He could still hear himself speaking with certainty about facts he did not actually know. The silence of the room felt uncomfortable. For perhaps the first time in his career, Charles fully understood that some mistakes could not be measured in dollars. They were measured in trust. In dignity. In the damage caused when people are judged before the truth is known. Across the city, Emily returned to her normal routines. She helped her father. She volunteered at the community center. She continued searching for stability after weeks of disruption. Although the investigation had cleared her name, the experience left a mark she would not soon forget. Still, she refused to become bitter. She believed that character was revealed not only during good times but also during difficult ones. And while she focused on moving forward, Charles Whitmore was reaching a conclusion of his own. Clearing Emily's name was not enough. Correcting the record was not enough. If he truly wanted to make things right, he would have to face the woman he wronged and say the words he should have considered long before making the accusation. 2 days later, Charles Whitmore finally made the call he had been avoiding. The number had been provided by hotel management after several discussions about how to formally address the situation. When Emily answered, there was a brief silence on both ends of the line. Emily, this is Charles Whitmore. She immediately recognized the voice. Hello, Mr. Whitmore. Her tone remained polite and calm. That somehow made the conversation more difficult. Charles took a breath. I would like to meet with you if you are willing. Emily looked out the window of her apartment. The city moved normally outside while memories of the past several weeks remained anything but normal. Why? She asked honestly. Charles did not try to hide behind formal language. Because I owe you an apology. Another silence followed. Finally, Emily agreed to meet. The following afternoon, they sat across from each other in a quiet conference room inside the hotel. There were no reporters. No executives. No lawyers. Just two people connected by a mistake that had changed both of their lives. Charles arrived first. When Emily entered, he stood immediately. For a moment neither spoke. Then Charles gestured toward a chair. Thank you for coming. Emily sat down. Her expression revealed neither anger nor warmth. Only patience. Charles respected that. He folded his hands together and looked directly at her. I was wrong. The words came more easily than he expected, yet they carried enormous weight. I accused you before knowing the facts. I allowed assumptions to become conclusions. And because of that, you suffered consequences you never deserved. Emily listened quietly. Charles continued. I spent weeks focusing on finding a watch. What I failed to consider was the effect my actions were having on an innocent person. He paused. There is no excuse for that. For the first time since entering the room, Emily lowered her eyes briefly. She had imagined this conversation many times. Yet hearing those words still felt different from what she expected. Charles continued speaking. I have spent my entire career believing quick decisions were a strength. Most of the time they helped me succeed. This time they hurt someone. The room remained silent for several seconds. Finally, Emily spoke. Do you know what hurt the most? Charles shook his head. It was not the suspension. It was not the rumors. She looked at him calmly. It was realizing that nobody asked who I was before deciding what I had done. Those words struck harder than any criticism could have. Charles understood immediately. The investigation had focused on actions, timelines, and evidence. Almost nobody had stopped to consider the person standing at the center of it all. You are right, he said quietly. And I regret that more than I can explain. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour. They discussed the investigation, the rumors, and the lessons both had learned. Charles discovered that Emily held remarkably little bitterness despite everything she endured. That realization increased his respect for her even more. Before the meeting ended, he presented an offer. The hotel would immediately reinstate her position if she wanted it. In addition, he intended to publicly clear her name and personally acknowledge the mistake he had made. Emily appreciated the gesture. Yet what mattered most to her was not the job. It was hearing the truth spoken openly. As she prepared to leave, Charles stood once more. I know I cannot erase what happened. Emily nodded. No. You cannot. Then she offered a small smile. But you can learn from it. After she left, Charles remained alone in the conference room for several minutes. The apology had not solved everything. Some damage could never be completely undone. Yet for the first time since the night of the gala, he felt he had taken a step toward doing what was right. And unknown to both of them, the decision they made that day would soon inspire far more people than either one ever imagined. In the days that followed their meeting, Charles Whitmore began doing something he had rarely done throughout his career. He spoke openly about a mistake. Rather than allowing the investigation to quietly disappear from public memory, he instructed the hotel to release a formal statement explaining exactly what had happened. The statement confirmed that Emily Parker had been completely innocent from the beginning. It explained that the missing watch had been recovered after an accidental mix-up involving a guest and that no theft had ever occurred. Most importantly, it acknowledged that assumptions had contributed to unfair consequences for an employee who had done nothing wrong. The announcement quickly attracted attention. Many people who had heard the original rumors now learned the full truth for the first time. Hotel employees shared the news. Community members discussed it. Local media outlets published updates correcting earlier speculation. For Emily, the public statement did not erase the difficult weeks. She had endured, but it provided something she valued deeply. The truth was finally visible. One afternoon, Emily returned to the hotel for the first time since her suspension. As she walked through the lobby, several employees approached her. Some offered hugs. Others simply smiled and welcomed her back. A few apologized for allowing doubt to influence their judgment. Emily accepted every apology with grace. She understood that people sometimes made mistakes when emotions and uncertainty took control. Daniel Foster met her near the front desk. "It is good to see you here again," he said. Emily smiled. "It is good to be back." Yet something had changed. Not only for her, but for everyone involved. The experience had forced many people to examine how quickly assumptions could become accepted as facts. Later that week, Charles attended a leadership conference where business executives from around the country gathered to discuss management and decision-making. Normally he would have focused on growth strategies and financial performance. Instead, he chose a different subject. Standing before hundreds of professionals, he shared the story of a decision made too quickly. He spoke about certainty without evidence. He spoke about the responsibility that comes with influence. Most importantly, he spoke about the human cost of being wrong. The audience listened carefully. Some executives appeared surprised by his honesty. Others nodded in quiet understanding. After the presentation ended, several attendees approached him. Many shared experiences of their own mistakes. Some admitted they had judged employees unfairly in the past. The conversation spread far beyond the conference room. Meanwhile, Emily continued volunteering at the community center whenever her schedule allowed. The children there cared little about corporate statements or public apologies. They simply enjoyed having her around. One evening, while helping a group of students complete a reading assignment, a young boy asked a question that caught her off guard. "Miss Emily, were you scared when people thought you did something bad?" Emily paused before answering. "Yes," she admitted. The boy looked concerned. "Then how did you keep going?" Emily smiled gently. "Because I knew the truth." The child thought about that for a moment before returning to his book. Yet his question stayed with her long after the session ended. Knowing the truth had helped. But so had patience. So had character. And so had refusing to become someone different because of what others believed. Across the city, Charles found himself reflecting on the same lesson. The watch had been recovered. The investigation was over. Yet the most important outcome had nothing to do with lost property. It involved understanding the difference between suspicion and proof. As both their lives slowly returned to normal, neither realized that the story would continue inspiring conversations throughout the community. Because sometimes the most valuable lesson is not discovered when everything goes right. Sometimes it appears only after a painful mistake reveals what truly matters. Several months later, life looked very different for both Emily Parker and Charles Whitmore. The controversy that once dominated conversations had faded into memory, replaced by something far more meaningful. People no longer discussed accusations. They discussed lessons. They discussed integrity. They discussed the importance of waiting for facts before reaching conclusions. For Emily, stability had gradually returned. She was back at work, respected by her colleagues, and once again focused on the simple routines that mattered most. She continued helping her father whenever he needed support. She continued volunteering at the community center. Most importantly, she continued living according to the same values that had guided her long before the gala. The experience had tested her patience and resilience, but it had not changed who she was. One spring afternoon, the hotel hosted a community appreciation event honoring local volunteers and educators. Unlike the glamorous charity gala that had started everything, this gathering felt warm and personal. Families attended. Students participated. Community leaders shared stories about people making a difference in everyday lives. Emily had no idea she was one of the guests being recognized until her name was announced. Surprised, she looked around the room as applause filled the hall. Charles stood near the stage and smiled. This time, hundreds of eyes were focused on her for a completely different reason. As Emily walked forward, she felt a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The same hotel where she once stood under suspicion was now celebrating her character and contributions. When she reached the stage, Charles addressed the audience. He spoke about leadership, responsibility, and the dangers of assumptions. Then he shared something deeply personal. He admitted that one of the most important lessons of his life came from a waitress who refused to let unfair treatment turn her bitter. The room grew quiet as people listened. Charles continued. Success is often measured by achievements, but character is measured by how we treat others when we have power over them. I learned that lesson later than I should have. Emily felt emotion rising in her chest. Not because she wanted recognition, but because she could hear the sincerity in his words. After the presentation ended, students from the community center gathered around her. Several wanted photographs. Others wanted advice about school and future careers. Watching from nearby, Charles realized something important. The most valuable thing Emily had protected throughout the entire ordeal was not her job. It was her character. That was why people trusted her. That was why children admired her. That was why the truth ultimately mattered. As the event came to an end, Emily stepped outside onto the hotel terrace overlooking the city. The skyline stretched across the horizon beneath the evening sun. A few moments later, Charles joined her. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Charles smiled. Quite a different ending than either of us expected. Emily laughed softly. Definitely. They stood quietly for a moment, watching the city lights begin to appear. Then Emily said something neither of them would forget. The truth does not always arrive quickly. But when it does, it gives people a chance to become better than they were before. Charles nodded. He knew exactly what she meant. The missing watch had been recovered. The investigation had ended. Yet the greatest discovery had nothing to do with lost property. It was the realization that every person deserves fairness before judgment and dignity before assumptions. As the sun disappeared beyond the skyline, both understood that the story had never really been about a watch at all. It had been about trust, character, and the courage to admit when you are wrong. And in the end, those lessons proved far more valuable than anything money could buy.